This screencast covers or gives an overview of the epidermis. So there are 4 or 5 layers of the epidermis. These layers can be either 4 layers in what's called the thin skin or 5 layers in the thick skin. Thick skin is thicker than thin skin, and it's found in the palms of our hands and the soles of our feet. This is important because these areas need a little extra protection, and so the 5th layer, the stratum lucidum, does provide that extra protection. So here's a quick overview of the 5 layers of the epidermis. You can see here that there are 5 different layers, and the cells look a little bit different in each layer. I like this diagram on the left because it shows that the stratum basal is actually curvy, whereas here it shows it as straight, but it is actually curvy. So the epidermis is an outer protective layer of the skin. It's the most superficial layer of the skin, and it's going to protect against 4 main categories of things. So the first thing that it'll protect against is water loss. It keeps water in our body. It doesn't keep all the water in our body, but it does keep a good deal of it in our bodies. It protects against mechanical injury, so this is physical injury. Sure, things can still puncture or penetrate or scrape off our skin, but as we go around throughout the day, our skin does provide a little bit of protection against physical or mechanical injury. The epidermis protects us against the effects of chemicals. Again, if you put acid on your skin, it will go through the epidermis, but if you're just using Lysol wipes to clean something up, it's not going to, the Lysol is not going to get directly in your bloodstream. It's going to be, the epidermis is going to help keep some of those chemicals out. And lastly, disease-causing microorganisms. So this is the same thing. If you walk around throughout the day, your skin is protecting you against microorganisms getting in, or other pathogens getting inside your body. So for example, if someone sneezes on a doorknob and you touch the doorknob, if they had the flu, you're not going to get the flu because your skin protects that. Now, we wash our hands frequently so that these microorganisms don't go from our skin into our body, for example, when we eat or when we rub our eyes. I still hope that no one is sneezing on a doorknob, but the skin does provide that layer so that microorganisms can only get in through openings or through mucous membranes. The epidermis does not have blood supply. As we talked about in the introduction, the epidermis is made up of stratified squamous epithelium, and epithelial tissue does not have its own blood supply. Like other epithelial tissue, the epidermis is located close to connective tissue. In this case, that connective tissue is called the dermis. The stratum basal is the deepest layer of the epidermis, and it's really close to the blood supply in the dermis, so those cells are very well nourished because they have close access to the blood supply. As you see here, cells move from deep in the stratum basal to more superficial in the stratum corneum. Now, the way this works is that cells are rapidly dividing here in the stratum basal, where there's a good nutrient supply and they're supplied with everything that they need. As new cells are rapidly dividing, it pushes the older cells upward. So the cells in the stratum basal now move upward towards the stratum spinosum, then upward and upward and upward. As the cells get further from down here, the source of nutrients, there are 2 things that are happening. The first thing is that the cells are getting further away from nutrients, which means they can't get the nutrients, which unfortunately means they die. However, there's also another process that occurs called keratinization that we're going to talk about in just a minute. And keratinization is really important because while the cells do die, they also become more harder and more protective as they reach the more superficial layers. Going from the stratum basal to the stratum corneum, it takes about 4 to 6 weeks. So keratinization is the process that I just mentioned by which older cells harden. So what happens is the cytoplasm, or like the kind of semi-solid, squishy part of a cell, fills with keratin proteins. Right, these are keratinocytes, are the cells that produce keratin, and keratin is a tough fibrous, waterproof protein that is going to make these cells hard and waterproof. So these are the cells in the more superficial layers of the epidermis, and then they will eventually shed off, and they don't have nutrient supply, but they are older and harder, which makes them more protective. Speaking of protection, calluses are a thickening of the skin where the epidermis rubs often. Because the epidermis rubs often, the skin produces more cells in order to add extra protection. And so you'll see calluses in areas where there's frequent rubbing. So for example, if you work with your hands a lot, or maybe play guitar or baseball, or if you have a ring that you always wear on exactly the same finger, you'll see calluses start to form there to protect against rubbing. So now we will briefly go into the layers of the skin and their functions. We'll start at the deepest layer, which is the stratum basal. This is also the thinnest layer of the epidermis, and it's just a single layer of columnar cells. Stratum basal means base layer, and this is where new cells are generated. So here, these cells are rapidly dividing to produce new cells. If we move a little bit superficially, which means these are still young cells, but they're a little older. And because remember, we get older as we move more superficially, we get to the stratum spinosum. The stratum spinosum is a fairly thick layer. It's also known as the spiny layer because they get prickly because they have little filaments that hold them to one another. So the filaments hold them to one another. When you dehydrate them in order to put them on microscope slides, they look spiny. And these, again, are young cells because they're just coming off the stratum basal, and they have a fairly good connection to the blood supply, which is going to be down here in the dermis. So they're still pretty close. Now we start moving a little more superficially to where we have keratinization occurring. The stratum granulosum is also called the granular layer. Here you have keratinocytes, which are producing keratin. So these are cells that produce keratin that is going to make the cells harder and waterproof. These cells here are flat and they're compressed. So here you see the stratum spinosum cells are kind of rounder and plumper. Here in the stratum granulosum, the cells are compressed and flattened. Next, we move up to the stratum lucidum. So this is the clear layer. This is the layer that's only found in the thick skin. So the thin skin on the rest of our bodies, not the soles of our feet or the palms of our hand, the thin skin does not have this layer. The thick skin, so that's where it's on your palms and the soles of your feet, does have the stratum lucidum. This has like 2 or 3 sheets or sublayers, we may call them. And this layer is made up of clear, flat, dead keratinocytes. And again, it's only in the thick skin. Lastly, most superficially, we get to the stratum corneum. This is also called the horny layer, which has to do with its rough shape and the fact that it is keratinized. You'll also know that the horn on a rhinoceros is also made of keratin. So this is the outermost or most superficial layer of the skin, and it is rough, dead, and keratinized. It is therefore waterproof, and it is a good protective layer. Here it has about 20 or 30 sheets of cells or sublayers of cells, and that thickness, as well as the keratinization, helps protect against outside threats. Lastly, we have an acronym. We should not want to get sunburned. However, it's a little bit of an easy acronym to remember. Come, let's get sunburned. So we start at the most superficial layer. We have the stratum corneum, the stratum lucidum if it's thick skin, stratum granulosum, stratum spinosum, and then finally the stratum basal is the deepest layer of the epidermis.